This episode is sponsored by Kendo UI. Kendo UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Bootstrap and Material. Go check them out at javascriptjabber.com/KendoUI. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel we have AJ O'Neill.
Wait, I'm not on the panel.
You are.
Fine. Yo, coming at you live from Provo.
I mean, you're also our subject matter expert, so it's both. I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. I just want to acknowledge, I guess, that I've been out for a few episodes, just taking some time off. But I'm back, and I'm feeling better. So anyway, I'm looking forward to talking to AJ about this particular topic, and that is LetsEncrypt and Greenlock. Did I get those right?
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to just kind of give a brief overview of what those two are? I mean, I use LetsEncrypt for my stuff, but I haven't really used Greenlock, so...
Yeah, so LetsEncrypt is a brand name, like Gmail is a brand name. It's also the first of its kind. The specification, like the specification for SMTP or for Gmail is email and SMTP. The specification for LetsEncrypt is called Acme, and hopefully there will be other brands that adopt that standard in the future. But for right now, it's a joint effort between Mozilla, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and then a number of sponsors. And what it is automated SSL, or technically it's TLS, but we all call it SSL, even though SSL died in the 90s.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, that's what I'm using it for is it's free to get your certificate. And yeah, then it provides the SSL or TLS encryption on your website.
Yeah, exactly. So it is a protocol that allows different methods of verifying and authorizing a domain to receive, or a client to receive a certificate on behalf of one or more domains. So you've got a device, a server, for example, it wants to get domains for example.com, www.example.com, api.example.com. This is the protocol that allows you to do it. And LetsEncrypt is the branded service that most people are aware of.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting to me. I use it and I'm sure a lot of other people do too, because it's free.
Yeah.
Right? It's free. I remember paying for a Wildcard domain. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with the process of getting a certificate, Wildcard domain is anything.devchat.tv. So, so it's got the splat or the star asterisk, yeah. .devchat.tv. And so I got a domain like that because I was doing all kinds of different things, and I didn't want to have to go get certificates every time I created a new subdomain. And that cost me a few $100s, I think. I mean, it was pretty pricey. And then all of a sudden, if I wanted to spin up something new on devchat.tv with LetsEncrypt, I just go and ask for a certificate, and it goes, okay, and it gives me one.
So
and it's free.
What have you been using to do that?
I think there's something called Certbot, which is a package. I think it's written in Python, if I remember right.
Yes, it is.
And it does all that good stuff for me. And then I set up, I think Certbot actually sets up the cron job for you to renew your certificate, because it has to renew every 90 days. So yeah, but yeah, so you can either set up a cron job, or you can install some program that will go and renew your certificate for you with LetsEncrypt.
Okay, so bringing up Certbot, this is the reason that I originally created Greenlock. I wanted to be able to because what I've been working on for quite a long time is towards having home servers, having devices in the home that can do cloudy stuff without having to pay rent to some cloud provider. And so I wanted to get HTTPS on small devices like Raspberry Pis. And at the time, I don't know if this is still the case, but when it came out, it used so much RAM with that Python client that it wasn't possible to use it on Raspberry Pis, or if it was like tedious and you had to do like a lot of extra steps or download a lot of stuff. I don't remember what it was, but it was very difficult to use in the beginning on a Raspberry Pi. And that's why I initially developed Greenlock. So Greenlock actually does what Certbot does in a more simplified form. So it doesn't manage Apache and Nginx or any of that. It simply manages a certificates directory, and it manages it in a very similar way to what Certbot will do, where the file structure is based off of the default configuration is not to use a database, but to use the same file structure that Certbot uses.
Right.
And so it started out as a Certbot clone, more or less. Certbot wasn't even called Certbot back then. It was called LetsEncrypt. And this Greenlock was also called LetsEncrypt back then. But then because they were trying to establish the brand identity of LetsEncrypt as a service provider and not as a utility tool, they split off the LetsEncrypt Python client to be called Certbot and handed it over to the EFF website. And then I renamed my Node.js LetsEncrypt client to Greenlock.js. And what it does that's different than Certbot is you were talking about how, it has to do the renewal and have a cron job. Well, if you want something that's going to work, if you're imagining a peer-to-peer network where some devices are Windows, some devices are Mac, some devices are Linux, relying on a system-specific tool like cron that's going to work differently on different systems or may not be available or may need extra setup steps isn't maybe realistic. And so by building the client in Node.js, I've made it so that it can work on Windows, on Mac, on Linux, on Raspberry Pi, all with very minimal download cost, very minimal CPU setup cost, and it can perform the renewal function inside of a Node.js app. So it can work standalone, just like the Certbot CLI can. Mm-hmm. It has, when you install it, it has a CLI tool that you can use, but really the best use for it is if you're building something where you want to have HTTPS on devices and you want to build a Node app that uses that encryption. So to have a Windows computer and a Mac computer talk to each other by a domain name. That's what I really built it for. And that's what I see a lot of when I see questions on Stack Overflow coming in. I'm really excited to see that people are doing interesting things, like they're building HTTPS proxies, and I can tell from like their code and their comments, like when they're sharing with me their issues, that they're doing the same thing that I'm doing. And it's really validating to see like this growth of this like indie web or peer web or web 3.0, whatever we want to call it. I'm really excited to see that people are interested in it. And that's in fact one of the predominant use cases for Greenlock.
Gotcha. So you want to just walk us through what it's like to use Greenlock?
Yeah. So there's a couple of different ways to use it. One is the CLI. So you can npm install it. Let me actually open up the docs here myself. I've been trying to make it so that it is not too node specific. So there's also some install instructions that just do curl bash. And I plan to get something like that for Windows. And in fact, we're working on a desktop client so that you could, particularly for Windows people, so that you could actually host a website from a desktop. But sorry, I'm tangenting a little. So you npm install -g Greenlock CLI if you want to use the CLI. And then that's a great way to test it out. It supports Acme version 2, or it's actually Acme draft 11/draft 12, but people mistakenly call it version 2. And so I do that too sometimes.
And it's version 2 because it's LetsEncrypt version 2, right?
Yes. So yeah, LetsEncrypt version 1 was actually a pre-draft implementation. So they were just kind of goofing around, if you will, trying to figure it out. Uh-huh. And draft 12 is the latest, and there's really only changes in the error handlers from draft 11. And that's what they call V2. And I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that's what will actually get finalized in the spec. It seems like it's pretty good.
So it'd be finalized in the spec as version 1?
I'm guessing that they're going to call it version 3.
Oh, you think so?
We'll see. If there's any breaking changes, I think that the first official version will probably be version 3, because there's so much of this confusion around like the branding versus the spec versus what's open source, what's the branded stuff is still quote open source, but it's branded, it's trademarked, it's
right.
So it's got that. Anyway, so you can run it and then give it some command line options. Like in the documentation, you can see it's actually a clone of the early version of Certbot. So some of the options have changed since then and they diverged, but dash domains, and you give it a list of domains or whatever. So if you're familiar with that, that's how the CLI version works. But what's really more interesting is what I call Greenlock-express. So I have a couple different flavors of it, and it's just kind of to present documentation differently to different people based on their needs. So there's Greenlock CLI, and that's just the CLI component. There's Greenlock, which is the core library, and then there's Greenlock-express, which is like the fast and simple way to use it, the way that I think most people are using Node, which is with Express apps. So you just require it. Because of the version changes and the incompatibility, in the spec, there's no version defined. And so when there's a version change, there's no super simple way to duck type and say, because the string says version 2, therefore it's version 2. You get back an object and the object matches whatever version it is. This is something the user doesn't have to deal with, but this is a little bit different. Usually you don't have to specify the version of an API that you're connecting to, but because of its history, and most people I think are still on the version 1 API, there's actually a version parameter, and then there's a server parameter. So the idea with the Acme spec is that it will work just similarly to email, where there's Gmail offers an email account, Yahoo offers an email account. Well, hopefully in the future, we'll see Google will offer, once the spec is finalized, I think is when companies will start investing, but hopefully we'll see, GoDaddy has an Acme server, and Google has an Acme server, and LetsEncrypt has an Acme server. And there's a security policy in place where you can define, like this is one of the best improvements in the web, especially for the pure web, is that in the old days, the way that certificate authorities worked was that if you bought a certificate from, say, VeriSign, well, any certificate authority in the world is authorized to sign any domain. So even though I bought my certificate through VeriSign, if someone were somehow able to get a root key of another certificate authority and be able to it wouldn't even be a forged certificate, it would be an authentic certificate. If they were able to put that on their server, they could redirect traffic, and everyone would see the green lock, and it would look like, oh, your site is secure. This is the real site, when actually it isn't. So one of the best things that LetsEncrypt has caused is now in your DNS settings, you can do what's called a CAA record. I think it's like certificates, authority, acceptance, or something like that. So you can actually say only, a browser should only trust a certificate if it's from let'sencrypt.org or whatever your authority is, which is really great. So in the library, I don't just assume that you're using let'sencrypt.org. I give you that in the example, and the copy and paste in all of the example files. That's the URL that I use, but it's always exposed as an explicit option. And I'm hoping that my optimism for others to adopt this will bring that about, and that will become useful. And so people will choose different servers, and then they'll set their DNS records to say, hey, only trust this. That way, when we have those occasional incidences where a root key gets compromised, your site would not be compromised because your DNS record says which authorities the browser should trust.
Right. That makes sense.
Then there's also a couple of other options that are specified, like the keys will either need to be saved to a database or to a file system. The default is to save it to a file system, so you give it the path. And you put in your email address, which is dual purpose. So one, it's going to be connected to your account with Let's Encrypt. Two, it will be registered with Greenlock so that if we have a security update or something that we need to be able to notify you, or if there's a mandatory change in the API that's a breaking change that's going to happen or something like that, we can notify the people that are integrating using Greenlock so that they'll be able to get that update and not have disruption of service, as well as we have a couple options in the config for submitting telemetry and being part of the community so that you could get other important updates and so that we can know how people are using Greenlock and be able to make it better. And then the most important option is that you give your Express app. So most people, I think, when they use Express, they're familiar with you do var express equals require express, var app equals express invoke, and then app.use, give it some functions, res.send hello world, and then app.listen and a port number like app.listen 3000. So with Greenlock, it handles the Acme challenges automatically. And it handles some of the TLS stuff automatically. So you can actually just create a new folder on your, in /serve/www/newsite.com. And there's a callback that you could say, hey, what I want is to check this folder when a new domain comes in. And if that folder exists, then go ahead and allow the domain through. So because there's all of this stuff that goes on in lower levels of node that most people don't deal with, Greenlock takes care of all of that in the SNI callback layer of the HTTPS module, and then handling the redirect of the HTTP module to go to HTTPS, and also handling the challenges that come in over HTTP. Handles all of that. And then your Express app is just your normal Express app, as if you were to call it with .listen 3000, except you don't. Instead, you do module.export equals app. That gets handed to Greenlock as the app parameter, and then your app functions as normal, but now it's being handed an encrypted, a decrypted connection that was secure and encrypted, and it never sees the unencrypted traffic.
That's cool. So you could conceivably even host without using something like Nginx or Apache or anything like that, and still use HTTPS. Yeah,
absolutely. And Node, I will tell you firsthand, as someone that has dug into the nasty and the networking stack a little bit, Node is not your best option for all types of web serving. In a lot of cases, something like Nginx, Caddy, or Lighty will do a much better job. But for these specific use cases where you're in an IoT industry, whether an enterprise or doing devices in the home, smart devices, that sort of thing, where you need a tighter integration and you want a small portable code base, Node can be a great platform for that.
Gotcha.
So it's not, if you're geared on, really strong byte per second performance, you're going to handle 10,000 requests, you do want to separate your static files out to something different. And Greenlock could still work for you in that case because it's a great integration tool. If you wanted to do an enterprise LetsEncrypt integration, Greenlock is a great tool for that. But you wouldn't use Greenlock also to do the web serving. You would just use it as the integration to handle. It has a plugin system that's in the documentation, and we already have plugins for like Cloudflare, Route 53, DigitalOcean, Azure, S3, Console, Redis. So these types of things are available if you want to go above and beyond and build something that's more systematic to be able to manage your certificates and pass them back and forth between devices that maybe aren't even powerful enough to run Node or just because Node's convenient to do that work in.
That makes sense. How does it work with things like Docker?
So, I have not really played much with Docker. To me, a lot of these things that other people see as convenient, I see as adding complexity that doesn't need to be there.
I think that's fair in some circumstances and probably not fair in others. I think there are some times where Docker really makes things easier. But if your focus is IoT or self-hosted or blah, 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 fill in the blank where you have some constraints or you have something simple, then yeah, Docker probably is overkill.
So it works with Docker. I've had issues where people have brought up like, oh, I'm doing this with Docker and blah, blah, blah. And it works for them. They had some little thing that they, usually it's the port forwarding, because if you're using Docker, you don't have to use internally in Greenlock. You don't have to use ports 80 and 443.
Right.
So that's the Acme spec. You either have to use the HTTP module, which we provide by default in Greenlock, or we also provide a plugin for a DNS module of your choice. And that's where I was mentioning Route 53 and Cloudflare, DigitalOcean. People have built plugins for those so that you can use them. Mm-hmm. But when you're doing your Let's Encrypt at the standard version, the standard way to do it with the HTTP validation is to do on port 80 and 443. Yeah. You can't change that. So if you're in Docker, I give you the option to be able to change those. And then oftentimes on the outside, you're listening on 80 and 443, and then Docker might be listening on 3000 and 8443.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But it works. One thing that you have to be aware of if you're using any type of ephemeral system, meaning a system where sometimes the storage is present and sometimes it's not, or between reboots, the storage resets, is that you can't use the default file system plugin. You'll need to look at one of the plugins that use a database and use that instead, because otherwise, when you reboot that system, you'll delete all of your account information for Acme and Let's Encrypt, and then you'll end up hitting rate limits because you're only allowed to create so many accounts per IP address and register so many domains per IP address and per week and things like that. So if you're on an ephemeral system where every time it boots, you're doing that whole process again, you could run into rate limit issues with the Let's Encrypt API.
I could see that. I think most folks, though, if they're deploying with Docker, they may be deploying multiple times a day. And yeah, then you might run into the rate limit because it's requesting every time it boots up. But you could also just have it check the certificate and say, if the certificate is, within such and such an age, because you can share with the host file system. You can say,
So in this, that's not a problem. So Greenlock actually automatically checks all the certificate dates and staggers out renewal. So,
okay.
So I believe, if I remember correctly, it starts renewal no earlier than 15 days before expiration and completes renewal no later than 10 days. And that's configurable. But if you don't want to get the Let's Encrypt emails telling you, hey, your certificate's about to expire, you need to renew before 10 days. So during that window, what basically happens is in the SNI callback, which is one of the deeper layers of Node that for HTTPS and generally TLS certificate handling, it'll actually check the date. It loads it into memory, and then just every time it sees a request come in, it'll just check and see what the date is. And then, when it gets within that 15 to 10 day window, it will set a timeout for some time in the future so that you're not renewing all of your certificates on the exact same.
Right.
And if I remember correctly, it actually sets that timeout when it loads. So it's not setting it at the time that it hits 15 days. It's generating a random time. So there's the actual certificate expiration, and then there's the stale time that's kind of a fudged number that's random between 15 and 10 days. So that way, you're not going to hit rate limits by having too many requests per day if you're constantly adding and removing domains or something. So if you were doing any sort of hosting as a service, which again is something that lots of people in these IoT spaces are doing, Greenlock is an excellent integration tool for that use case for these reasons.
That makes sense.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io.
So what challenges did you run into when building Greenlock?
Well, I mean, I imagine that some people just hearing me talk have gotten a little confused. I get confused sometimes. It's, I mean, if you've ever implemented OAuth 2, there's a lot of handshakes and it can get confusing.
Yeah.
And the Let's Encrypt protocol, Acme protocol, it's very beautiful. It works. It's almost a golden bullet to me in that it can work in very small single user instances, but it also is built so that it will work great in the enterprise. And the detail that they put into the security measures is just beautiful. The way that they're using modern security measures like Jose, which is part of the Jose JWT, JWS standard for authentication, authorization, and signing. So it's very, very beautiful, but at the same time, it's very tedious to implement. And there's a lot of minor details where you do one little thing wrong, and it can take you a while to figure out what you're doing wrong. Like I've actually had to compile the Go. Their platform is called Boulder, and it's open source. So that's the server side of implementation. The reference implementation is called Boulder, and I've actually had to look at some of their code and download some of it, because between the RFC spec, which is very dry, and what was actually happening, I was confused as to I think I'm sending the right object. I think I have the right properties, but I'm getting this opaque error message that's maybe opaque for security, or maybe just because they didn't pass through every possible error case. And in some cases, it's just an error happened. And so I actually had to compile the Go code and then console.log the output in my node, right? Or I sent it to the server and then read that in as a text file and run it through their Jose parser and see, this is why, because I was missing this property, or it turns out this was the nonce. One case that was interesting was, so you can do up to 100 domains at a time, but you need a nonce, which is we have salts for passwords. For secure APIs, we have nonces. Right. So in every request, you include a nonce, and that goes in your signature. And basically what it means is that even if an attacker is able to capture the encrypted traffic and then replay the encrypted traffic opaquely, not knowing what it does, there are cases where that would work and the attacker could cause an action to happen. Because of the nonce, every request is unique. So whether it succeeds or fails, it has to have this nonce value, this random salt value. And so if you want to validate 100 domains, you actually need 100 nonces. Right. And if you are just naively, doing what you normally do, where you create a promise.all and you map through the requests you need to make, and you want to do these in parallel, well, if you only had one nonce, you got 99 requests that are guaranteed to fail. Right. So there's little things like that it's just I wasn't used to doing it. And so it's oh, well, duh. But it was a gotcha for me.
That makes sense. I'm also curious. So this is a command line interface tool. And I mean, most people that listen to this show are probably building web technology of some kind, with a smattering of server-side stuff and mobile stuff. So what do you run into building command line interfaces?
Well, first, I want to clarify, this is not a command line tool. This is an integration for Acme servers to get SSL certificates, for which I have also built a command line tool. But the primary use case is people using it with Express. Okay. That said, I didn't run into too many snags with the command line tool.
Pretty well solved, huh?
Well, this is pretty simple. It's just taking in some arguments and passing them to the library. So there's a couple different ways the tool can be used. Like you can use it with Apache, you can use it with Nginx, you can use it with a standalone node process. You can use it just for testing. Like the command line tool, I think for most people that are using Greenlock is most valuable for the ability to test it and be like, well, if it works with this known working code, then I know something's wrong with my code.
Oh, I gotcha.
Or just kind of taking an example of it. If somebody's building something where they need to pass in some options because what they're building is serving domains from maybe different users or something. But I have had experiences with other command line tools that I've built. So to address that question, even though it's not on the topic, I would say testing on Windows is really important. It's something that I feel like is really hard to do as a node developer. Well, just because it seems like as developers, we all have Macs. But there are a large number of developers that I want to include. Like, I dream of a world where the average high school student that is not computer savvy, but has an interest, like, that hunger and thirst to learn, would be able to, use tools that are secure and that work well. The kind of tools that scale all the way down to the single high school student, but could also be, are elegant enough to be used in an enterprise environment. And so as part of that in mind, even though I'm not on Windows very often, I want to test in Windows more often because I want things to be easy and to just work even for Windows people that don't have the same tools. And that's one of the reasons that I don't like build tools, and I'm not a big fan of like Babel and TypeScript and all that. It's because I really want the things that I create. I really want a high school student with a very limited amount of knowledge to be able to copy and paste and struggle through the README a little bit and get something working and show somebody like, hey, I have a secure web server and it's hosted on my laptop. But like path names are different in Windows. You don't have Unix sockets in Windows. You have pipes, which work very similarly, but there's just a few peculiarities to them. And I think the path names is a big one. I didn't know this for a while. You should never concatenate path strings in Node. Don't do it because you'll break Windows. But if you use path.join, even if you're using forward slashes instead of backslashes like most of us are, path.join will actually intelligently switch your forward slashes to backslashes on Windows. And the Node team has tested that really well. So as long as you're not manually concatenating any path strings and you're using things like path.join or the tools that are in Node to do that, that's one way to make stuff better for Windows users so that you don't get bug reports about things breaking. But Windows is just different. And no matter how much we try to abstract it and make it feel like a normal development environment, it's got quirks and you have to test on Windows.
Right. So one other thing then, just to clarify, you said that Greenlock is not a command line tool. It comes with a command line tool. So if you're going to pull this into an Express app, then you just include it as a dependency and do some config?
So it's the other way around, but yeah. So you just include it as a dependency, it's like just a few config items. It's your email address, that you accept the terms of service, and what the domains, either the list of domains, a static list of domains that isn't going to change, or a callback that has some sort of check that could go to the file system or the database or whatever, but provides some sort of way to check if a domain is allowed. Because there's a security issue that I'd love to talk about. Bring me back around to that. But you include your Express app into the Greenlock server. You don't include the Greenlock server in your Express app because Greenlock operates at a lower level. It has to handle details of TLS that are really fun to learn, but generally the average developer doesn't want to have to deal with. And so you're actually, Greenlock in that case is acting as your server. You're telling Greenlock to integrate with the node APIs at the lower level. And then at the higher level, you're just bringing in your app. Like I said before, instead of doing app.listen, you're doing module.exports equals app. And then you're doing require my express app.
I see.
To bring it in.
So you're running Greenlock and including your app.
Yeah. So Greenlock is actually what's encapsulating, again, because it has to do this low level stuff that there wouldn't be a way to like do app.use Greenlock. That wouldn't work because Greenlock has to operate down at the network socket and TLS layer, not up at the high level HTTP layer.
Gotcha.
So from your perspective, I mean, like I'll link this to you in the chat, just the docs page there. But if you take a look at it, I think you'll see, despite my tendency to like want to over explain things and tell you like all the nitty gritty details, it's a very small little snippet of config there that you'll see right under the quick start screencast. And in the screencast, I go through, I mean, I'd highly recommend you take a look at it. It's like 10 minutes long, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I go through like, here's how it works normally. And then I say, and here's the errors that 90% of people are encountering. Like most of the time when I get an issue, if they had watched the errors part of the screencast, because I think a lot of people stop like once they get through the 2 minutes of this is how you do it.
Right.
There's the next couple minutes of like, here's the errors you'll encounter. Most of the errors that people bring up issues for are things that are covered in that screencast. So it's things like not having write permissions to the directory where you want to save the certificates, or trying to use port 3000 when you actually have to use port 80 unless you're port forwarding or SNI routing or something like that.
Right. Makes sense. So you kind of said that there's a tutorial and a screencast on how to use it. Where do people find that?
So I linked it to you. We can include it in the show notes. So it's on my personal Git. So it's git.koolaj6.com/koolaj6/greenlock-express.js. And that's shows you the list of features. It shows you the quick start video and then snippets. And then there's an examples folder where it's how to use it with Node's new HTTP module or HTTP2 module. How to use it with Speedy, how to use it with virtual hosting, how to use it with WebSockets.
Right.
And as people raise up issues on things that I think, oh, this would be good to throw in the examples, I try to make sure that, there's an example for everything. Because a lot of people are used to just kind of using WebSockets and Express, where I think it's a little unfortunate. Sometimes we tend towards these 3-line examples, which are great because they give us popularity, but they obscure like really important information. Like the way that most people use WebSockets, they don't even know that you could just pass your server into the WebSocket and you could be exporting your whole WebSocket app. That you don't have to. Yeah. So there's a couple things when you're doing something like this. You actually need to have your server instance be a server instance that's separate, and you pass that to WebSockets. And with the case of Express, you're letting Greenlock run the server instance, and you're passing your Express app to Greenlock. So there's a couple things like that they're extremely simple. But because in all these READMEs, you just see the 3-line example where they cut out all of the configuration to show you like, here's the most minimal way you could possibly use this. You don't see it, and it might seem like it could be complicated, but it's not.
Makes sense. Is there anything that we should have dived into here that we didn't?
Oh, security. There was a couple issues of security I wanted to touch on.
Okay.
So we have new vulnerabilities that never. Well, how to say this? So sometimes there's these problems in life, like you were walking around barefoot for the longest time, and you got blisters on your feet, and then somebody invents a shoe, but the way the shoe is designed, you're likely to get blisters just on your heel. And so instead of people having the mindset of thinking like, oh, like this shoe is better in every way, except it's not as good for my heel, they say, well, this shoe gives you blisters on your heel. But really, you were getting blisters on your feet the whole time. So there's a number of security issues that weren't necessarily created by Let's Encrypt, but Let's Encrypt brought to light, and that we weren't concerned about before. Like, they were always there. They were always problems. But now that we have like this great tool, and there's like a couple little, problems, like you could look at it in a negative light and say, oh, well, this created new security vulnerabilities, but they were actually always there. We just didn't, because we didn't have the thing protecting our soul, we weren't worried about our heel. And so what happens with Let's Encrypt is, one thing is SNI injection and spoofing. This is something that was never really done before because HTTPS was so cumbersome and it was so like manual that we didn't have network tools that inspected SNI packets. So SNI, server name indication, is when the browser wants to make a handshake with a server, it needs to say, what certificate do I want? So I want the certificate for google.com. So the browser, this is one of the unencrypted pieces of information. This is one of the things about HTTPS that people don't want to know, is that you can actually, even though HTTPS encrypts your traffic, there's a number of side channels that you can use to get information about what a person's doing online. So the SNI header is necessary because it allows the server that's responding to give a certificate, but it also tells what site you're visiting. But you can also construct a client, not a browser, to do, to put SQL instead of a domain name. So instead of putting google.com as the SNI header, you could put drop table students. And if if the thing that's handling your SNI to do dynamic domain certificate issuance is connected to a database and you're not securing that, if you're not sanitizing that data, which is, I actually have an open issue, I need to make sure that my sanitization of the SNI headers is good, because I realized the other day that I think there's a couple cases where it's not properly sanitized. But, if you were just passing this value straight to a database to, do this benign lookup of what domain should I be serving the certificate for, you could let an attacker not be able to see the result other than perhaps by an error message, or more likely a timing delay. But you have, this potential vulnerability that you could be introducing. Also, we always had this problem with certificate issuance where a certificate authority could somehow be compromised and it could be issuing certificates for domains that it should not be authorized for. The user did not say, yes, I want to allow this, but the authority could issue domains anyway. This has happened from time to time. Well, with Let's Encrypt, one of the early vulnerabilities that caused the CAA record to be introduced was that attackers were able to use like rogue WordPress installations or something to be able to get certificates for subdomains to valid sites, which would allow them to get around attacks. Where, like, generally, if you're on an HTTPS site, you can't load a non-HTTPS script, and you can't load certain things that are outside of your origin, like there's cookie permissions and stuff like that. So attackers were actually able to use vulnerable software to use the Let's Encrypt account service to get the certificates and then be able to use those cookies to do malicious things, because the domain policy, the security policy, was now, quote, in effect. So this could have happened before, but now that it's easier to get encrypted certificates, it's easier to exploit these things, and that's why the CAA record was introduced. There's also I get this wrong sometimes, hypertext public key pinning, HPKP, which is another way. So the CAA record is at the authority level, saying this is the authority that I allow. HPKP is at the client level. So your server can say, this is the key that I use to sign my certificates with. So that's something that you can use to further secure. And all of these things contribute to the pure web. Like, when anybody can get encrypted connections, that means two people can talk to each other. And even if they have to use a relay in the middle, the channel is private. And that's what's most important. about a peer-to-peer connection. More than data efficiency, it's the privacy of the channel. And so this, these kinds of technologies allow for that. And I think that that's really awesome. In fact, I was super excited to see that Mozilla IoT has been using Greenlock and also Beaker Browser. So you may have heard of those. They're both very interested in the peer web and the indie web and stuff. Mm-hmm. So it was like super cool to find out that they were using Greenlock as well.
Awesome.
If there's anything I've said that's confusing that you want me to simplify or dumb down, feel free to ask. Most of the stuff is simpler than I managed to make it sound because the way that I process information and think about things, and I tend to explain more details than are necessary.
Well, I think it gives people a bit of a framework. I mean, most of these shows we can't cover in depth in an hour for people to completely understand a topic, right? So this gets people deep enough to where they can go look at the source code for Greenlock. They can go check out Let's Encrypt. They can go look at the Acme specification, and then they can get an idea of what's going on here, and they can dive deeper if they want. So I think you've put a lot out there that gives people kind of an easy framework to get started with.
I'm going to include another link. So I actually built a browser version of Greenlock as well. It's not quite the same API yet. But one of my goals with Greenlock, as crazy as it sounds, is I believe this is completely possible. And hopefully I'll have the time to work on it. I actually want to get so that you can serve a secure website from within a browser. And so not necessarily for that. I don't remember why I started doing it. I think I was just trying to understand the V2 spec. This was back when I was implementing the draft 11/V2. Mm-hmm. But I went through and I didn't know whether or not it would work, but I just started out this way because I was like, well, maybe it will. And it did. So I implemented the Acme spec in the browser, and so more is going to come out of this. But right now I just have a blog article that's like all 12 steps in detail with examples of what the requests and responses look like. That may or may not be easier for someone to understand the RFC spec. Mm-hmm. But that we actually will probably be selling domains in the future, and so we have Greenlock.domains. Currently, there's a kind of a demo app on there that you can use to get your certificate instantly in the browser. Obviously, there's not automatic renewal because you're downloading the file and you're copying it over to your WordPress instance or whatever. But we plan to do more along that line. And also, I should mention, I just launched a Patreon. And part of that is to support Greenlock. So I'll put a link there as well.
Yeah. Definitely put a link for that in the show notes. And then, anything else we want to jump on before we do picks?
No.
All right. Well, do you want to go first or do you want me to go first?
You go first.
Okay.
Deploy more, pay less with DigitalOcean, the simplest all-in-one cloud computing platform for developers. Scale and run cloud applications faster and more efficiently with effortless administration tools to robust compute, flexible configurations, networking services, real-time alerts, and rapid provisioning while enjoying industry-leading price to performance with a flat pricing structure across all global data center regions at any usage volume. Spend more time building better web apps and less time worrying about managing infrastructure with DigitalOcean. Build your next app on DigitalOcean. Get started with a free $100 credit at do.co/Jabber.
So, as I mentioned at the start of the show, I took a few weeks off. I was pretty burned out, pretty stressed out. I'm still working on some of the infrastructure stuff for the podcasts. I'm actually building my own app in Rails. Probably going to put a Vue front end on it. I'm kind of playing with Stimulus.js as well, so I'm kind of thinking about that. We should probably do an episode on that one. Anyway, but yeah, so I spent some time on that and just worked on it, kind of in a no stress way. Got a whole bunch of stuff done on it. And that was very, actually, how do I put it? It kind of healed my brain, I guess, a little bit, because my stress level went down because I was just coding and not obligated to be anywhere or do anything. Yeah. Took a few naps during that week, just stuff like that. was really, really a positive experience. And then last week, my family, we went to a family reunion and just rented a house in Laverkin, Utah, which is right near Zion National Park. And we didn't actually go to Zion National Park. We went down to the reservoir one day and played on the lake. And most of the time just spent time together playing board games or just resting. I got a nap pretty much whenever I wanted one. And so that was a super positive thing as well. I basically got a week where I think I answered 2 emails, and it was because Michelle, my executive assistant and podcast producer, reached out and said, can you answer this, or can you handle this? So it was all really, really just a positive thing. And so I'm kind of back in it now and feeling better about things, and, know where I'm going next with a lot of this stuff, which was also part of the time that I took just to clarify what I want to do and where I want to wind up at. So anyway, I just recommend to people, a lot of times we get caught up in all of the stuff we have going on and all of the things we have to do. And, you stress out about work, and then you go home and you write open source software and stress out about that. Just take some time off. Seriously. That's my pick, is just taking time off. But yeah. How about you, AJ? What are your picks?
So I think this week, I thought I had something else too, but I don't remember right now. But so everybody listens to this show knows I love game music. I pick game music all the time, and today is no exception. I'm picking some game music. So there is a jazz album from Press Start up on Overclocked Records. I haven't actually bought it yet. I've just been listening to the samples, but I think I may want to support these guys. And it's just got jazzy versions of Mario and Zelda and some other things. And I got to say, if you like jazz and you like video games, you've got to scour Overclocked Records a little bit and pull out their jazz stuff. And also, when it gets to be Christmas time, it is amazing how many video games have great Christmas music, because they have like winter levels or actual like Christmas town or something like that in the game. Mario has tons of it, with all the Mario 64 snow levels and stuff like that. So anyway, I love game music. I think it's great. I think that in general, I love music, and I want to see more diversity in music in general. And so I really love sites like Overclocked Records and Bandcamp and things like that, where it's just something that's got a little bit more grit to it than what you're going to hear usually on the radio. It's not just songs written by that one dude in Sweden that comes up with every single top 40 song lyrics ever. So, yeah.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for talking through this with us, AJ. I know that Let's Encrypt is something that people have talked about, and I just love the idea of having a clean and relatively simple integration with things like Express. Or if you want to go do your own thing, you've got the CLI and stuff like that where you can
and the plugins.
On it. Yeah, and the plugins. So, where do people find the plugins? I'm curious.
Well, so different people, I try to keep track of them. Like I try to search every once in a while, because sometimes people tell me like, hey, I built this plugin, and sometimes they don't, and I just find it on NPM. So on the main documentation page for Greenlock-express.js, there's a plugin section, and that's where they're listed. And if anybody, wants a plugin, that is something that would be like great to let me know about, especially if you wanted to make a Patreon pledge and then give me some information about a plugin. Because I'd love to, personally develop more of these. I think there's some really good ones that are still missing, but we've got a good start and some good examples to draw from to kind of copy and whatnot. But yeah, that's where they're listed, and I would be happy to list more. So if you are building one, you want help, please open an issue. Sometimes I get backlogged and I can't answer right away, but I try to be responsive about these, and that's part of what the Patreon is for, is to help me be in a situation where I can be very responsive to some of these core projects that I'm maintaining and building. And yeah, I'd love to help, and I'd love to contribute to more of them myself in the future.
Sounds good. All right. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up right there, and we'll catch everyone next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.